He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but in less than 10 minutes, that decision would expose everything he had carefully built as nothing more than illusion. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe dignity matters more than appearances, stay with this story. The grand concert hall shimmered beneath golden chandeliers, each crystal reflecting the soft glow of stage lights onto polished marble floors that stretched like a mirror beneath the audience's feet. Rows of velvet seats were filled with elegantly dressed guests, their murmurs blending into a low, refined hum that carried the unmistakable energy of expectation. Tonight wasn't just another performance. It was a celebration of brilliance, of reputation, of a man who had spent years crafting an image so untouchable that few dared to question it. At the center of it all stood Victor Delacroix, a name that echoed through the world of classical music with both admiration and quiet intimidation. His tailored black suit fit him like a second skin, every movement precise, every gesture deliberate. When he placed his hands on the piano, the room obeyed him. Silence fell as if commanded, and the first notes that emerged were flawless, cascading through the hall with practiced perfection. The audience leaned forward, captivated, their applause waiting patiently at the edges of each phrase. But beneath that polished exterior, something colder lingered. Victor did not simply perform music. He controlled the room, shaped it, judged it. His gaze occasionally drifted beyond the spotlight, scanning the audience not with curiosity, but with quiet superiority, as if measuring worth in silence. And that was when his eyes paused. In the far corner of the hall, partially hidden behind a column and shadow, sat a woman no one else had noticed. Her dress was simple, soft gray fabric that blended into the dim surroundings, her posture composed yet unremarkable. She did not lean forward like the others, nor did she react with visible awe. She simply watched, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. To most, she was invisible. To Victor, she was an anomaly. He missed a note. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a fraction of hesitation, a flaw that only the most trained ear would detect. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. The performance continued, flawless once more, but the moment lingered in his mind like an unwelcome echo. When the final chord resonated and dissolved into silence, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in admiration. Victor stood, bowed, and accepted it all with practiced grace. Yet his attention had already shifted elsewhere. As the applause softened, he stepped closer to the microphone placed beside the piano, a faint smile forming, one that did not quite reach his eyes. Music, he began smoothly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hall, is often misunderstood. Many believe it's about talent, but in truth, it is about discipline, about mastery. The audience nodded, some murmuring in agreement. He let the silence stretch, then added, almost casually, and sometimes, it's amusing to see how people perceive their own abilities. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, uncertain but willing. His gaze returned to the corner. You, he said, pointing, not aggressively, but unmistakably. Heads turned, confusion spreading as the spotlight operator hesitated before following his gesture. The beam of light cut through the dimness and landed on her. The woman blinked once, adjusting to the sudden brightness, but did not flinch. A murmur spread through the audience. Who was she? Why her? Victor's smile widened, subtle but sharp. Would you join me on stage? He asked, his tone light, almost playful. The question hung in the air, but it wasn't really a question. It was an invitation wrapped in expectation, edged with something far less kind. The audience shifted, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. Some smiled, sensing entertainment. Others exchanged glances, unsure. The woman remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her breathing calm. There was no visible resistance, no embarrassment, no eagerness either. Just stillness. And then, slowly, she rose. The room quieted, not out of respect, but out of intrigue. As she began to walk, her steps measured, the soft echo of her shoes against marble seemed louder than it should have been. Victor stepped aside from the piano, gesturing with exaggerated courtesy, the faintest trace of mockery beneath the surface. He believed he understood this moment completely. He believed he was in control. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that the silence building in that room was not anticipation of amusement. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The distance between her seat and the stage was no more than 40 feet, yet with every step, the atmosphere shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Conversations dissolved into whispers, then into nothing at all. The soft echo of her shoes against the marble floor carried through the hall with unnatural clarity, as if the building itself had decided to listen. Victor watched her approach with a composed smile, one hand resting casually against the polished edge of the grand piano, his posture relaxed, almost theatrical. To him, this was still entertainment, a moment to assert dominance, to remind the audience of the invisible line between mastery and mediocrity. The woman reached the steps of the stage and paused for a brief second, her eyes lifting toward the lights that now framed her in full view. There was no hesitation in her expression, no sign of embarrassment, only a quiet awareness of the moment she had been placed into. Victor extended his hand, not to help her, but to present her, as if unveiling a prop in a carefully orchestrated act. "Please," he said, his tone smooth, inviting the audience to share in the spectacle. A few scattered chuckles rose from the crowd, uncertain but encouraged by his confidence. She stepped onto the stage without taking his hand. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, yet something about it caused a subtle ripple of tension to pass through the front rows. Victor's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before returning to its polished form. "Have you ever played before?" he asked, his voice amplified gently through the microphone, ensuring every word reached the farthest corner of the hall. It was not a genuine question. It was a setup. A few audience members leaned forward, anticipating the answer, already prepared to laugh at whatever came next. The woman met his gaze, her eyes steady, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "A little." The simplicity of her answer drew a few more amused reactions. Victor nodded slowly, as if confirming an expectation he had already decided upon. "Perfect," he replied, stepping aside with a graceful sweep of his arm. "Then tonight is your chance." The words sounded generous, but the undertone carried something sharper. He moved just far enough to give her space at the piano while remaining close enough to observe every movement. The spotlight followed her as she approached the bench, its brightness revealing details the shadows had hidden before. Her hands were still, relaxed at her sides, not trembling, not uncertain. That, more than anything, felt out of place. Most would have faltered under the weight of hundreds of watching eyes, under the silent pressure of expectation and judgment. She did not. The audience shifted again, the earlier amusement softening into curiosity. Something about her composure did not align with the role she had been assigned. Victor noticed it too. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes sharpened slightly, searching for a flaw, a sign that this moment would unfold exactly as he intended. The woman sat down at the piano bench with quiet precision, adjusting her position just enough to align herself with the keys. She did not rush. She did not perform nervous gestures. She simply existed in the moment, as if the room had already faded into the background. A faint murmur drifted through the audience, quickly silenced as she placed her hands gently above the keyboard without touching it. The distance between her fingers and the keys lingered for a heartbeat longer than expected. The room responded instinctively. A hush fell, deeper than before, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted into place. Victor folded his arms loosely, watching, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the awkward hesitation that would confirm his assumptions. He believed he understood exactly how this would end, but as the silence stretched, becoming almost tangible, it was no longer clear who was in control of the moment. And for the first time that evening, the confidence in Victor's posture carried the faintest trace of uncertainty. Her fingers hovered just a fraction of an inch above the keys, suspended in a stillness that stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for a few in the audience to exchange uncertain glances, long enough for Victor to tilt his head ever so slightly, as if silently urging the inevitable misstep to arrive. And then it came, but not in the way anyone had imagined, because the first note she played was soft, almost fragile, a single tone that seemed to hesitate as it entered the vast space of the hall, and for a brief moment, a few quiet chuckles slipped from the back rows, subtle, restrained, but present, confirming what many believed they were about to witness, a harmless attempt that would collapse under pressure. Yet she did not react, did not rush, did not even acknowledge the sound of doubt around her. Instead, she allowed that single note to settle, to breathe, before her fingers moved again, and when they did, something shifted, not abruptly, but with a precision so controlled it felt almost invisible at first. The second phrase flowed into the first with an ease that erased the earlier hesitation, her hands gliding across the keys with growing confidence. Each note placed exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not forced, but guided by something deeper than performance. And the laughter stopped, not because anyone decided to stop, but because it simply no longer fit the moment. The sound of the piano began to fill the hall differently now, richer, fuller, layered with a depth that demanded attention rather than invited it. Victor's posture straightened slightly, his arms still folded, but the casual ease that had defined him moments earlier began to fade, his eyes narrowing as he listened more closely, searching for inconsistency, for weakness, for anything that would restore the balance he believed in. But it was not there. The melody unfolded with increasing complexity, her left hand anchoring a steady foundation while her right danced effortlessly across higher registers, weaving patterns that felt both intricate and inevitable, as if the music had always existed and she was simply revealing it. The audience leaned forward now, not out of amusement, but out of something closer to disbelief. The transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a quiet, almost uncertain opening had evolved into something commanding, something that carried authority without ever needing to announce it. And then came the moment that changed everything, a subtle shift in tempo, a transition that required not only technical precision, but complete control, the kind of control that could not be improvised, could not be faked. Her fingers accelerated with clarity rather than chaos, every movement deliberate, every note clean, the sound cascading through the hall like a controlled surge of energy, and Victor felt it, the recognition that settled in before he could deny it. Because he knew this passage, he knew its difficulty, knew the exact point where even skilled performers often faltered, and he watched as she moved through it without hesitation, without strain, as if the challenge itself did not exist for her. His expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough for those closest to the stage to notice, his confidence no longer absolute. The room responded in kind. The silence deepened, not empty, but charged. Every person present now fully aware that they were no longer witnessing a joke. Something else had taken hold of the moment, something that no one had anticipated, and as her hands continued across the keyboard with unwavering precision, the realization began to form, quiet but undeniable, that the woman seated at the piano was not simply playing. She was in complete control, and the man who had invited her onto that stage was no longer the one guiding what happened next. The music did not simply continue. It evolved, rising into something far more deliberate, far more commanding than anything that had been planned for that evening. Her hands now moving with a confidence that erased all memory of the fragile first note, the tempo building with measured intensity, each phrase unfolding with clarity and purpose. And the deeper she went, the more unmistakable it became that this was no ordinary performance. Because she was no longer following a familiar structure, she was reshaping it, subtly at first, introducing variations that only a trained ear would recognize, altering timing, shifting emphasis, weaving complexity into passages that had originally been predictable, and Victor heard it, every alteration, every deviation from what he himself had played earlier, his mind racing as he tried to track what she was doing, because this was no longer replication. It was interpretation at a level that demanded authority, and authority was something he believed belonged only to him. His arms slowly lowering from their folded position, his stance adjusting almost unconsciously as he stepped a fraction closer to the piano, his attention fully captured now, no longer observing, but studying, searching for a flaw that refused to appear. The audience sensed it as well, the shift in energy, spreading row by row. The earlier curiosity replaced by a focused stillness, the kind that settles when people realize they are witnessing something rare, something they cannot fully explain, her left hand driving a powerful, steady rhythm while her right hand moved with astonishing agility. crossing registers with seamless precision, notes cascading in patterns that felt both complex and inevitable, as if the instrument itself had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal its full voice. And then she did something that made Victor's breath catch ever so slightly. She introduced a passage that mirrored the one he had faltered on earlier, but instead of avoiding it, she leaned into it, expanding it, transforming it into something more demanding, more intricate, a variation that required not only technical mastery, but complete control of timing and expression, and she executed it flawlessly. Every note placed with intention, every transition smooth, undeniable, and in that instant, the realization struck him with quiet force. She had heard his mistake, not only heard it, but understood it, analyzed it, and now, without a single word, she was correcting it, elevating it, exposing it, not with arrogance, but with precision so refined it left no room for denial. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on her hands as they moved across the keys with unwavering certainty. The confidence he had carried onto that stage now shifting into something far less comfortable, because control had slipped from his grasp without any dramatic confrontation, without any announcement. Simply through the undeniable authority of her performance, the room responded in silence, a deep, resonant stillness that carried more weight than applause ever could. No one moved. No one spoke. Every person present drawn into the unfolding moment as if bound by it. And at the center of it all, the woman remained composed, her expression calm, her focus absolute, as though the presence of hundreds of watching eyes meant nothing at all, as though this was not a performance, but a truth finally being revealed. And Victor, standing just a few feet away, understood something he had never expected to confront, that the stage he believed he owned had never truly belonged to him. And as the music surged forward, reaching a level of intensity that left no doubt about who commanded it, the illusion he had built around himself began to fracture, quietly, invisibly, but completely, and the room, once filled with admiration for him, now held its breath for her. The music climbed higher, no longer confined to the expectations of the piece, no longer bound by the structure Victor had once presented as flawless, her interpretation expanding beyond imitation into something undeniably original, something that carried both discipline and freedom in perfect balance. And as her fingers moved with increasing speed and precision, the sound filled every inch of the hall, not as noise, but as presence, a force that demanded attention without ever raising its voice. The audience sat motionless, their earlier assumptions now replaced by a quiet, almost reverent focus, because what they were witnessing was no longer surprising. It was undeniable, and that distinction changed everything. Victor stood still beside the piano, his usual composure now held together by habit rather than certainty, his eyes fixed on the keys as if searching for a moment where control might return to him. But it never did, because she did not allow the music to falter, not even for a breath. Each transition executed with absolute clarity, each phrase resolved with intention, and then she introduced something no one expected, a passage so technically demanding that even seasoned performers would approach it with caution, yet she entered it without hesitation, her hands moving across the keyboard with a speed that did not sacrifice precision, every note landing exactly where it belonged, the rhythm steady, the phrasing deliberate, and beneath it all, an emotional depth that transformed technique into something far more powerful, something that could not be replicated through practice alone. Victor recognized it instantly, not just the difficulty, but the meaning behind it, because this was not a display, it was a statement, a quiet but unmistakable declaration that what he had treated as a stage for control had become a space for truth. His posture shifted again, the confidence that once defined him now replaced by a stillness that bordered on disbelief. His hands no longer relaxed, his shoulders no longer at ease, the subtle signs of someone realizing that the narrative they had constructed was slipping beyond their influence. And the audience felt it too, the shift spreading through them like a silent understanding. No longer watching out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because this was not a coincidence. This was mastery, and mastery could not be dismissed, no matter how unexpected its source. Her playing reached a peak that seemed impossible to sustain, yet she held it there, balancing complexity and control with a calm that defied the intensity of the music itself. And then, just as the energy reached its highest point, she did something even more powerful. She slowed, not abruptly, but with intention, guiding the music into a softer, more deliberate passage, allowing every note to resonate, to linger, to settle into the silence that surrounded it. And in that moment, the entire hall seemed to breathe with her, the tension releasing not into applause, but into something deeper, a collective stillness that carried more weight than any reaction. Victor's gaze lifted from the keys to her face, searching for something he could still define, something that would restore his understanding of the moment. But what he found instead was calm, unwavering composure, the kind that did not seek validation, did not demand recognition. It simply existed, and that was what unsettled him most, because there was no arrogance, no attempt to prove anything, only the quiet certainty of someone who already knew. And as the final sequence began to form beneath her hands, the realization settled fully into the room, not as a sudden shock, but as a truth that had been building from the very first note, that the woman seated at the piano had never been part of his performance, and the stage, the music, and the moment now belonged entirely to her. The final sequence did not announce itself with force. It emerged with intention, her hands slowing just enough to let each note carry its full weight, every tone placed with a clarity that seemed to stretch time itself. The music no longer racing forward but unfolding, deliberate and controlled, as if she was guiding the entire room through something far more profound than performance, and the audience followed without resistance, their stillness no longer born from surprise, but from complete surrender to the moment. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. The hall held its breath as the final phrases took shape beneath her fingers, and Victor, standing just a few feet away, felt the distance between himself and the piano grow in a way that had nothing to do with space, because what separated them now was not position, but understanding. He watched as she resolved the final progression with a softness that carried more authority than anything loud or dramatic could achieve, her hands pressing the last chord with perfect balance, allowing it to resonate fully before lifting away, not abruptly, not hesitantly, but with quiet certainty. And then there was silence, not the kind that waits for applause, but the kind that arrives when something undeniable has just taken place, a silence that filled the room completely, pressing against the walls, settling into every corner, holding every person exactly where they were. And in that silence, the truth stood clear, no explanation required, no introduction needed. The woman who had been invited onto the stage as a joke had just delivered a performance that could not be questioned, could not be dismissed, could not be undone. Victor remained still, his expression no longer composed in the way it had been before, his eyes fixed on the piano, as if searching for something that was no longer there. The certainty he once carried now replaced by a quiet, unmistakable realization, because he understood what had just happened, not only that she had outperformed him, but that she had done so without effort, without arrogance, without ever acknowledging the challenge he believed he had set. And that was what unsettled him most, because there had been no confrontation, no need to prove anything. Only the quiet presence of mastery revealing itself when given the smallest opportunity. The audience felt it too, the shift in perception moving through them as they began to understand that what they had witnessed was not a moment of luck, not an unexpected coincidence, but the unveiling of something that had always been there, hidden beneath simplicity, overlooked because it did not demand attention. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, a single person in the front row began to clap, the sound breaking through the silence like a small crack in something much larger, followed by another, and then another, until the entire room rose to its feet, the applause building not into noise, but into recognition, a collective acknowledgement of what had just taken place. Yet even as the sound grew, the woman did not react. She did not stand to receive it, did not turn to face the audience. She simply remained seated for a brief moment longer, her gaze resting calmly on the keys as if the world around her had yet to return. And when she finally stood, it was with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning. No urgency, no need for validation. She stepped away from the piano without looking toward Victor, without seeking his reaction, because she did not need it. And in that simple act, the final shift occurred. The stage that had once belonged to him no longer felt like his at all. And as she began to walk away, leaving behind the echo of something far greater than applause, the room understood that what they had just witnessed was not the rise of someone new, but the revelation of someone who had never needed the spotlight to begin with. The applause continued to rise, filling the grand hall with a sound that no longer belonged to admiration alone, but to realization, to the quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just taken place. Yet she did not slow her steps, did not turn to face the crowd, her movement steady and composed as she made her way toward the edge of the stage, the spotlight trailing her briefly before losing her to the softer shadows beyond. And it was in that moment, as the distance between her and the piano grew, that the weight of what had happened began to settle more deeply into the room. Because the performance had ended, but its impact had not, Victor remained where he stood, unmoving, his eyes following her path as if trying to reconcile the image before him with the certainty he had carried just minutes earlier. The contrast was too stark to ignore, too complete to dismiss, and for the first time that evening, he did not step forward to reclaim the stage, did not reach for the microphone, did not attempt to reshape the narrative, because there was nothing left to control. The silence that had once served him now stood against him, holding him in place as the audience's attention shifted entirely away. And then, from somewhere near the center rows, a voice broke through the applause, not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough to carry. "That is her." The words floated across the space, subtle at first, almost lost within the sound. But they did not disappear. Instead, they spread, repeated quietly between those who recognized what others had not yet understood, a murmur building not from speculation, but from memory, from familiarity, from something that had been hidden in plain sight. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the atmosphere shifted once more, not into noise, but into awareness, because recognition carries a different kind of weight, and as it moved through the audience, the energy changed from astonishment to something closer to disbelief. Victor heard it too, the words reaching him not as sound, but as meaning, his expression tightening slightly as he searched his own memory, his mind turning through names, through faces, through performances he had studied, admired, competed against. And then it surfaced, not fully formed, but enough to unsettle him, enough to fracture what remained of his certainty. He took a small step forward, almost unconsciously, his gaze shifting from the empty space she had left behind back to the piano, as if the instrument itself might confirm what he was beginning to suspect. But it offered nothing, only silence, and that silence spoke louder than any confirmation could. The audience's attention no longer rested on him, no longer sought his presence, because the focus had moved beyond him entirely. The stage he had once commanded now felt like a place he no longer understood. And as the murmurs grew clearer, as more voices joined in quiet recognition, the truth began to take shape, not announced, not declared, but realized, that the woman who had walked onto that stage without introduction, without acknowledgement, had never been ordinary, had never been unknown. She had simply chosen to remain unseen, and in that choice, she had allowed the moment to reveal itself without force, without explanation, leaving behind something far more powerful than reputation, something that could not be created through fame alone. And Victor, standing in the center of it all, understood what that meant, because for the first time in years, he was not the one being recognized. He was the one who had failed to see, and the room, filled with applause that no longer belonged to him, made that truth impossible to ignore. The murmurs did not fade. They grew, weaving through the standing crowd like a quiet current of realization that no longer needed confirmation, because recognition has a way of settling into a room without permission. And as more faces turned, more voices whispered, the name that had not yet been spoken aloud began to take shape in the minds of those who had once studied recordings, who had once followed a career that had disappeared without explanation, a career marked not by loud fame, but by an almost untouchable precision that had left even the most respected musicians in quiet admiration. Victor felt it fully now, the weight of memory aligning with the truth unfolding before him, his breath steady but his thoughts no longer anchored in certainty, because the fragments were connecting, the style, the phrasing, the unmistakable control. It was not just mastery, it was familiarity, and familiarity at that level could not be coincidence. He took another step forward, slower this time, as if the stage itself had changed beneath him, his eyes shifting once more toward the path she had taken off the stage, but she was no longer visible. Only the soft movement of curtains and the dim glow of backstage lights remained, and that absence spoke louder than any presence could. Because she had not stayed to be recognized, she had not waited to be acknowledged, she had simply left, allowing the truth to settle on its own, without guidance, without declaration, and that choice carried its own kind of authority. The audience continued to stand, the applause still present, but now layered with something deeper, something that moved beyond admiration into reflection, because they understood now that what they had witnessed was not an introduction, but a revelation. And Victor, standing alone beside the piano that had once been his instrument of control, felt the full extent of that realization, his posture no longer commanding, no longer centered, but still, almost anchored in place by the understanding that had arrived too late. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because there was no other response left that would hold meaning. The stage lights above seemed brighter now, not because they had changed, but because the illusion they once supported had been stripped away, leaving only what was real. And in that clarity, the contrast became undeniable. The difference between performance and truth, between control and mastery, between reputation and substance. The audience began to shift slowly, some turning to one another, exchanging quiet words, others remaining still as if unwilling to break the moment just yet. And among them, a few individuals moved with a different kind of urgency, stepping toward the aisles, their expressions focused, searching, as if hoping to catch even a glimpse of her before she disappeared entirely. But she had already moved beyond reach, her presence lingering only in memory and sound. And Victor understood what that meant in a way that could not be undone, because the moment he had created to entertain had instead revealed something far greater than he had intended, something that could not be reclaimed or redirected. And as he finally lifted his head, looking out across the hall that no longer belonged to him, he realized that the silence she had left behind was not empty at all. It was complete, and within it, every assumption he had once relied on had quietly come to an end. The hall did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like that do not simply end. They linger, they settle into the space and reshape it quietly. And even as the applause began to soften and people slowly lowered themselves back into their seats, there was a visible shift in how they looked at the stage, at the piano, at the man who still stood beside it. Victor remained motionless for a few seconds longer, as if the weight of the moment required time to fully register. His hands, now resting loosely at his sides, no longer positioned with the precision he once maintained, his gaze drifting across the audience, not searching for approval, but encountering something far more unfamiliar, reflection, because the admiration that had once filled the room was no longer directed toward him. It had moved, quietly but completely, and he understood why. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty to hide behind, only the clear and undeniable truth of what had just unfolded. He stepped forward at last, not with the confident stride that had defined him earlier, but with a measured pace that carried a different kind of awareness. The microphone still stood where he had left it, waiting, offering him the chance to speak, to reshape the narrative, to reclaim some part of the moment. But when he reached it, he did not speak immediately. He paused, looking down briefly as if choosing his words carefully, or perhaps realizing that there were no words that could truly alter what had already been revealed. The audience watched in silence, not impatient, not expectant, simply present, and in that stillness, he lifted his head. His voice, when it finally came, was steady, but softer than before, stripped of the edge that had once defined it. "There are performances," he said slowly, "and then there are truths." He stopped there, allowing the words to settle, not elaborating, not attempting to explain, because anything more would have diminished their meaning. He stepped back from the microphone almost immediately, the simplicity of his response carrying more weight than any elaborate justification could have. And in that moment, something shifted within him, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that would remain long after the night ended. because for the first time in years, he had been reminded of something he had long overlooked, that mastery does not need recognition to exist, and that respect cannot be demanded, only earned. The audience remained quiet for a brief moment longer, absorbing what had been said, before a different kind of applause began, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, respectful, directed not at performance, but at understanding. And Victor acknowledged it with a small nod, not as acceptance of praise, but as recognition of the lesson that had unfolded before him. Beyond the stage, the corridors of the hall carried a different energy, conversations forming in hushed tones, people recounting what they had just witnessed, some attempting to name her, others simply describing the moment as something they would not forget, yet she was already gone, her presence existing only in memory, untouched by the noise that followed. And perhaps that was the final truth of it all, that she had never come for recognition, never needed validation. She had simply responded to a moment, and in doing so, revealed something that could not be unseen. And as the lights in the hall slowly dimmed, returning the space to its usual calm, one thing remained clear to everyone who had been there. That night had not been about a famous pianist, nor about a performance gone wrong. It had been about a quiet presence that changed everything without ever asking for attention. And in the silence that followed, the room remembered what dignity truly looked like.